wedding reception was in full swing, a joyous celebration filled with laughter and loud music. Guests mingled, danced, and raised their glasses in toasts to the newlyweds. Amidst the festivities, 12-year-old Aliyah sat quietly at a corner table, her dark eyes scanning the room with a distant gaze. She wore a pretty dress and had her hair neatly styled, but her demeanor contrasted sharply with the cheerful atmosphere around her. As the party continued, Aliyah's discomfort grew. The constant chatter and boisterous laughter seemed to close in on her. She fidgeted in her seat, her hands twisting the napkin in her lap. Her eyes darted nervously towards her father, Walter, who was engaged in animated conversation with other guests. To anyone observing, Walter appeared to be a jovial, proud father. But Aliyah knew a different side of him, one that filled her with dread and anxiety. Unable to bear the pressure any longer, Aliyah slipped away from her table and made her way to the bathroom. Once inside, she locked the door and leaned against it, finally allowing herself to breathe. The muffled sounds of the reception filtered through, a stark reminder of the joy she couldn't share. Aliyah's reflection in the mirror showed a young girl struggling to maintain composure. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she blinked them back, determined not to ruin her makeup or give away her distress. As she stood there, fighting against her emotions, Aliyah's mind raced. The weight of her secret felt unbearable. She thought about her best friend, the bride, and how this day was supposed to be a celebration of love and new beginnings. Yet for Aliyah, it felt like a cruel reminder of the darkness in her own life. Outside, the party continued unabated. The DJ announced another dance, and the sound of people cheering and moving to the dance floor echoed through the walls. Aliyah took deep breaths, trying to calm herself. She knew she would have to return soon, to put on a brave face and pretend everything was fine. But the longer she stood there, the more difficult it became to maintain the facade. After what felt like an eternity, Aliyah splashed some cold water on her face, careful not to smudge her makeup. She looked at herself in the mirror one last time, straightened her dress, and with a deep breath, unlocked the door and stepped back into the hallway. As she made her way back to the reception, Aliyah's steps grew heavier. The music seemed to grow louder, the laughter more intense. She paused at the entrance to the main hall, watching as couples twirled on the dance floor and friends clinked glasses in celebration. Her eyes found her father again, now standing near the bar, his booming laugh carrying across the room. Something inside Aliyah snapped. The contrast between the joy surrounding her and the pain she carried became too much to bear. As if in a trance, she walked towards the center of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. The DJ was just finishing a song, and in the momentary lull, Aliyah's voice rang out. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice shaky but determined. Heads turned, conversations halted, and the music faded. All eyes were now on Aliyah, standing small but resolute in the middle of the dance floor. Tears began to stream down her face as she took a deep breath and continued. "My dad. He locks me in the basement when he gets angry," Aliyah said, her voice breaking. "He hurts me, and I can't take it anymore." The room fell into stunned silence. The joyous atmosphere evaporated instantly, replaced by shock and disbelief. Aliyah's eyes met her father's across the room, seeing the anger and panic rising in his face. But she didn't stop. Years of pent-up pain and fear poured out as she continued to speak, revealing the horrors she had endured. The wedding reception, once a scene of celebration, had transformed into a battlefield of emotions. Guests stood frozen, trying to process the devastating revelation. The bride and groom, Jessica and her new husband, rushed to Aliyah's side, offering support and comfort. Walter, meanwhile, found himself suddenly isolated as people stepped away from him, their expressions a mix of disgust and fury. As Aliyah's words hung in the air, the party descended into chaos. Some guests moved to protect Aliyah, while others confronted Walter. The sound of someone calling the police could be heard over the commotion. In a matter of minutes, a joyous wedding reception had become the stage for a long-hidden tragedy to finally come to light. The sound of sirens pierced through the chaotic atmosphere of the wedding reception. Within minutes of Aaliyah's shocking revelation, police officers arrived at the venue, their presence adding to the tension that had engulfed the celebration. As the police entered, they quickly assessed the situation. Officers approached Walter, who had retreated to a corner, his face a mix of anger and fear. "Sir, we need you to come with us," one officer stated firmly, reaching for his handcuffs. Walter, realizing the gravity of the situation, didn't resist. He allowed himself to be handcuffed and escorted out of the reception hall, all while maintaining his innocence. The guests watched in stunned silence as Walter was led away. Murmurs of shock and disbelief rippled through the crowd. Some shook their heads in dismay, while others whispered furiously to one another, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. The once joyous atmosphere had been completely shattered, replaced by a heavy cloud of confusion and anger. As Walter was being taken into custody, other officers approached Aaliyah, who was still surrounded by Jessica and her husband. They spoke to her gently, asking if she was okay and if she needed medical attention. Aaliyah, exhausted from her emotional outburst, could only nod silently, her eyes red from crying. Meanwhile, Jessica, the bride, tried to regain some control over the situation. Despite the shock of what had just happened, she recognized the need to manage the crisis. She approached the center of the room, her white wedding dress a stark contrast to the somber mood. "Everyone, please," Jessica called out, her voice trembling slightly. "I know we're all in shock right now. What Aaliyah has revealed is devastating, but we need to stay calm." She paused, looking around at the faces of her friends and family. "This is a serious matter that needs to be handled by the authorities. I ask that you all please give Aaliyah the space and respect she needs right now." Despite Jessica's plea, the tension in the room continued to escalate. Guests began to take sides, their voices rising as they argued about what had just happened. Some defended Walter, unable to believe that someone they knew could be capable of such acts. "There must be some mistake," one guest insisted. "Walter's a good man. He wouldn't do something like this." Others rallied behind Aaliyah, their voices filled with anger and support for the young girl. "How dare you defend him?" another guest shouted. "Can't you see what that poor child has been through?" As the arguments intensified, Aaliyah's mother stood frozen, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. She seemed torn between rushing to her daughter's side and following her husband. The weight of the situation appeared to paralyze her, leaving her standing alone amidst the chaos. In the midst of the commotion, one figure stood quietly observing the scene. Mrs. Thompson, Aaliyah's teacher, had been invited to the wedding as a friend of the family. She watched the unfolding drama with a mix of horror and concern, her mind racing as she processed what she had just witnessed. As a teacher, Mrs. Thompson had always had a special connection with Aaliyah. She had noticed the girl's withdrawn behavior and occasional bruises, but Aaliyah had always brushed off her concerns with excuses. Now the full gravity of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. Mrs. Thompson's instincts as an educator and protector kicked in. She realized that this situation was far more serious than anyone could have imagined. The revelations made by Aaliyah pointed to a long-term systematic abuse that had gone unnoticed or ignored by those around her. As she watched Aaliyah being comforted by Jessica and questioned by the police, Mrs. Thompson made a decision. She knew that her role in Aaliyah's life was about to change dramatically. This was no longer just about being a teacher. It was about being an advocate for a child in desperate need of help. Mrs. Thompson began to move through the crowd, her mind already formulating a plan. She knew that the coming days and weeks would be crucial for Aaliyah's well-being and for ensuring that justice was served. As she approached Aaliyah and the officers, she steeled herself for the challenging road ahead, determined to do whatever it took to protect her student and bring the truth to light. The wedding reception, which had started as a celebration of love, had transformed into the beginning of a long and difficult journey towards justice and healing. As the police finished their initial questioning and prepared to leave with Walter in custody, the guests began to disperse. The festive mood completely evaporated. What remained was a sense of shock, a community divided, and a young girl whose brave decision to speak out had irrevocably changed the course of many lives. In the days following the wedding reception, Mrs. Thompson wasted no time in organizing a community meeting. She sent out emails, made phone calls, and posted flyers around the neighborhood, urging people to come together and address the issues raised by Aaliyah's revelation. The local community center agreed to host the event, providing a neutral ground for what promised to be a difficult discussion. On the evening of the meeting, people filed into the community center's main hall. The atmosphere was tense, with hushed conversations and wary glances exchanged between attendees. Mrs. Thompson stood at the front of the room, her normally cheerful demeanor replaced by a look of grim determination. "Thank you all for coming," Mrs. Thompson began, her voice steady and clear. "We're here to discuss the events that occurred at Jessica's wedding reception and, more importantly, to address the serious allegations of child abuse in our community." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. This is not an easy topic, but it's one we can no longer ignore. As Mrs. Thompson laid out the purpose of the meeting, the crowd's reactions were mixed. Some nodded in agreement while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The division that had begun at the wedding reception was clearly still present. "We need to create an environment where victims feel safe to come forward," Mrs. Thompson continued. "Aaliyah's bravery in speaking out has opened our eyes to a problem that may be more widespread than we realized. We must support her and any others who may be suffering in silence." As the meeting progressed, people began to speak up. Some voiced their support for Aaliyah, praising her courage and calling for immediate action to protect vulnerable children in the community. Others, however, were more hesitant. "How do we know she's telling the truth?" one man called out. "Walter's been a part of this community for years. It seems hard to believe he could do something like this." His words sparked a heated debate. Voices rose as people argued back and forth, some defending Walter's character while others insisted on the importance of believing victims. The meeting, intended to unite the community, seemed to be driving them further apart. Amidst the chaos, Aaliyah sat quietly at the back of the room, flanked by Jessica and her mother. The young girl looked overwhelmed by the attention and the intensity of the debate raging around her. Jessica, still in protective mode, kept a comforting arm around Aaliyah's shoulders. As the arguments escalated, Jessica decided it was time to intervene. She stood up, gently encouraging Aaliyah to join her. Together, they made their way to the front of the room, where Mrs. Thompson gratefully stepped aside to allow them to speak. "Please, everyone," Jessica called out, her voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't about taking sides. This is about protecting our children and creating a safe community for everyone." She turned to Aaliyah, giving her an encouraging nod. "Aaliyah has something she'd like to say." The room fell silent as Aaliyah stepped forward. Her small frame seemed to shrink under the weight of all the eyes upon her, but there was a determination in her stance that hadn't been there before. "I know some of you don't believe me," Aaliyah began, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm not lying. I've been scared for so long, and I couldn't take it anymore." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I don't want any other kids to feel the way I did. We need to talk about this, even if it's hard." Aaliyah's words had a profound effect on the room. The anger and skepticism that had dominated the meeting seemed to deflate, replaced by a somber realization of the pain this young girl had endured. Even those who had been vocal in their defense of Walter fell silent, unable to argue in the face of Aaliyah's raw honesty. As Aaliyah finished speaking, Jessica stepped forward again. "We can't change what's happened," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "But we can change what happens next. Aaliyah needs our support, and so do any other victims who might be out there. We need to come together as a community and say that we won't tolerate abuse in any form." The meeting concluded with a renewed sense of purpose. While not everyone was fully convinced, the majority of attendees seemed to recognize the need for action. Plans were made to establish support groups, improve reporting mechanisms for suspected abuse, and provide resources for families in need. As people began to file out of the community center, there was a mix of emotions in the air. Some were energized by the call to action, while others still seemed unsure about how to process the information they'd heard. But one thing was clear: the community would never be the same. Aliyah's brave decision to speak out had set in motion a chain of events that would force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths and work towards creating a safer environment for all children. As the community meeting drew to a close, Aliyah's mother, Sarah, sat in the back row, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. She had listened to every word, every argument, and every plea for action. The weight of her daughter's revelation and the community's reaction bore down on her, forcing her to confront truths she had long tried to ignore. Sarah's mind raced as she replayed the events of the past few days: the shock of Aliyah's public announcement at the wedding, the arrest of her husband Walter, and now this community meeting. It all felt surreal. She had always known that Walter had a temper, that he could be harsh with Aliyah, but she had convinced herself it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Now, faced with the reality of the situation, Sarah felt a deep sense of shame and guilt wash over her. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah remained in her seat, unable to move. She watched as Aliyah stood at the front of the room with Jessica, accepting words of support and encouragement from community members. The sight of her daughter, looking both vulnerable and stronger than Sarah had ever seen her, brought tears to her eyes. Meanwhile, Jessica and Aliyah made their way through the dispersing crowd. Jessica kept a protective arm around the young girl, shielding her from any potentially hostile reactions. Despite the emotional toll of the meeting, Aliyah seemed to stand a little taller, empowered by the act of speaking her truth. "You did so well, Aliyah," Jessica said softly. "I'm so proud of you. How are you feeling?" Aliyah took a deep breath before responding. "Scared," she admitted, "but also relieved. I've been holding this secret for so long. It feels good to finally say it out loud." As they reached the back of the room, Aliyah's eyes met her mother's. The two looked at each other, a mix of love, pain, and uncertainty passing between them. Sarah stood up, hesitantly approaching her daughter. "Aliyah, Sarah began, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I should have protected you. I should have seen what was happening." Before Aliyah could respond, Mrs. Thompson approached the group. She had been watching the interaction from afar and sensed that both Aliyah and Sarah might need support. "Sarah," Mrs. Thompson said gently, "I know this is a difficult time for all of you. There are resources available, counseling, support groups. I'd be happy to help you get in touch with them." Sarah nodded, grateful for the offer but still overwhelmed by the situation. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "Everything's changed so quickly." As the small group stood together, the last of the meeting attendees filed out of the community center. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Word of the meeting had spread, and concerned citizens, some holding homemade signs, had assembled to show their support for Aliyah and other potential victims of abuse. Aliyah, noticing the crowd through the windows, tugged on Jessica's sleeve. "What's going on out there?" she asked, a mix of curiosity and apprehension in her voice. Jessica peered outside, then turned to Aliyah with a small smile. "Those people are here for you, Aliyah. They want to show you that they believe you and support you." The realization seemed to bolster Aliyah's confidence. She straightened her shoulders and after a moment's hesitation said, "I want to go out there. I want to talk to them." Sarah looked alarmed at the suggestion, but Mrs. Thompson nodded approvingly. "If you feel ready, Aliyah, I think that would be very powerful, but only if you're comfortable." With Jessica and Mrs. Thompson flanking her and Sarah following closely behind, Aliyah made her way to the community center's entrance. As the doors opened, A hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to the young girl who had sparked this movement. Taking a deep breath, Aaliyah stepped forward. Her voice, though soft, carried clearly in the expectant silence. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "I was scared to tell the truth, but now I know I'm not alone. No child should have to go through what I did. We need to protect each other and speak up when something's wrong." As Aaliyah spoke, the crowd listened intently. Some wiped away tears, while others nodded in agreement. When she finished, a spontaneous applause broke out, growing into a thunderous show of support. The impromptu speech marked a turning point. What had started as one girl's brave confession was now becoming a community-wide movement. As Aaliyah stood there, surrounded by supporters and with her mother watching in a mix of pride and remorse, it was clear that the fight against child abuse in their community was just beginning. In the days following the community meeting, Sarah found herself grappling with a torrent of memories and emotions. As she watched her daughter's courage in the face of adversity, Sarah began to confront her own past experiences of abuse and silence. One evening, as Aaliyah slept peacefully in the guest room of Jessica's house where they had been staying, Sarah sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen. Her mind wandered to her childhood, recalling instances of her own father's volatile temper and her mother's silent compliance. The patterns of behavior she had witnessed as a child had seemed normal then, but now they took on a sinister new light. Sarah's hands trembled as she realized how she had unknowingly perpetuated the cycle of abuse. She had married a man like her father, ignored the warning signs, and allowed her daughter to suffer the same fate she had endured. The weight of this realization was almost unbearable. As dawn broke, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't change the past, but she could take control of her future and protect her daughter. With newfound determination, she reached out to Mrs. Thompson, who had offered to connect her with support services. Later that day, Sarah met with Mrs. Thompson at a local cafe. The teacher listened patiently as Sarah poured out her heart, sharing her own history of abuse and her feelings of guilt and shame. "Sarah," Mrs. Thompson said gently, "it's not uncommon for victims of abuse to find themselves in similar situations as adults. But recognizing the pattern is the first step towards breaking it. You're doing the right thing by seeking help." With Mrs. Thompson's guidance, Sarah made an appointment with a therapist specializing in domestic abuse cases. She also enrolled in a support group for parents of abused children, determined to learn how to better support Aaliyah through the healing process. Meanwhile, Aaliyah was finding her own path to healing. Mrs. Thompson had introduced her to a support group for young abuse survivors. Initially reluctant, Aaliyah found comfort in the shared experiences of the other children. During one session, Aaliyah listened as a boy named Marcus shared his story. "I thought I was the only one," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was so scared to tell anyone." Aaliyah nodded, understanding all too well the fear and isolation Marcus described. When it was her turn to speak, she found the words coming more easily than before. "I felt the same way," she said. "But when I finally told the truth, I found out that there were people who wanted to help me. It's still scary sometimes, but I don't feel alone anymore." As the session progressed, Aaliyah realized that by sharing her story, she wasn't just helping herself. She was also giving courage to others. The thought filled her with a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. Back at Jessica's house, Sarah and Aaliyah were slowly learning to communicate more openly. One evening, as they sat together on the porch swing, Sarah turned to her daughter. "Aaliyah," she began, her voice filled with emotion, "I want you to know how sorry I am. I should have protected you. I should have seen what was happening." Aaliyah was quiet for a moment, processing her mother's words. "Why didn't you?" she finally asked, her voice small but steady. Sarah took a deep breath. "I was scared," she admitted, "and I didn't want to believe that your father could do something like that. But that's no excuse. I failed you, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." As they talked, mother and daughter began to bridge the gap that had grown between them. It was a painful conversation, filled with tears and difficult truths, but it was also the beginning of healing for both of them. The next day, Sarah had her first session with her therapist, Dr. Patel. As she recounted her history and recent events, Dr. Patel listened attentively, offering support and guidance. "Recovery is a journey, Sarah," Dr. Patel explained. "It will take time and there will be difficult moments. But you've taken the first step, and that's incredibly brave." As the session drew to a close, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time in years, she felt like she was taking control of her life. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but with the support of Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Patel, and the strength she saw in Aliyah, Sarah was determined to break free from the cycle of abuse and create a better future for herself and her daughter. That evening, as Sarah and Aliyah shared a quiet dinner with Jessica, there was a sense of calm that hadn't been present before. They were far from healed, but they were on the path to recovery, taking it one day at a time. As the days passed, the pressure on Walter intensified. He remained in custody, awaiting trial, but his influence was far from gone. Walter's defense attorney, a sharp-suited man named Richard Dawson, began a calculated campaign to discredit Aliyah's claims. Dawson held a press conference outside the courthouse, his voice confident as he addressed the gathered reporters. "My client, Walter Thompson, categorically denies all allegations against him," Dawson declared. "We believe that young Aliyah, while undoubtedly troubled, is mistaken in her accusations. We will prove Mr. Thompson's innocence in court." The attorney's words spread quickly through the community, reigniting debates and causing some to question Aliyah's story. Walter, seizing the opportunity, began to reach out to old friends and colleagues, pleading his case and claiming that Aliyah was lying for attention. When Aliyah heard about Walter's attempts to manipulate the situation, she was devastated. "Why doesn't anyone believe me?" she cried to Jessica one evening, her body shaking with sobs. Jessica held the young girl close, her own anger at Walter's tactics barely contained. "Many people do believe you, Aliyah," she reassured her. "We can't let Walter win by giving up now." Determined to counter Walter's narrative, Jessica reached out to her contacts in local media. She proposed an event to raise awareness about child abuse and to gather support for victims like Aliyah. The idea quickly gained traction, and soon plans were underway for a community fundraiser. The event, titled Voices for the Voiceless, was scheduled to take place in the town's Central Park. Local businesses donated food and supplies, volunteers set up booths with information about recognizing and reporting abuse, and a small stage was erected for speakers. On the day of the event, the park was filled with people. Some came to show support, others out of curiosity, and a few to voice their skepticism. Aliyah, nervous but determined, stood backstage with Jessica and Sarah preparing to address the crowd. As Aliyah stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the gathering. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the sea of faces before her. "My name is Aliyah," she began, her voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. "For years I lived in fear. I was abused by someone who was supposed to protect me, but I'm not hiding anymore. I'm here to tell my story and to help other kids who might be going through the same thing." As Aliyah spoke, her words seemed to touch something deep within the community. Even those who had come with doubts found themselves moved by the young girl's courage and sincerity. By the time she finished her speech, many in the crowd were wiping away tears. The event was a resounding success. Not only did it raise a significant amount of money to support child abuse prevention programs, but it also generated a wave of media attention. Aliyah's story was featured in local newspapers and on regional news stations, bringing the issue of child abuse to the forefront of public discourse. In the wake of the fundraiser, more victims began to come forward. The local police department reported an increase in calls reporting suspected child abuse, and support groups saw a surge in attendance. Aaliyah's bravery had created a ripple effect, encouraging others to break their silence. However, the increased attention also brought new challenges. Walter's supporters became more vocal, some even resorting to online harassment of Aaliyah and her family. Sarah received threatening phone calls, and nasty comments appeared on social media posts about the fundraiser. Despite these attempts at intimidation, Aaliyah and her supporters stood firm. The community rallied around them, with neighbors taking turns keeping watch over Jessica's house and local tech experts helping to secure their online presence. As the date of Walter's trial approached, tensions in the community continued to rise. Aaliyah, knowing she would have to testify, worked with a child psychologist to prepare for the ordeal ahead. Sarah, too, was preparing to take the stand, ready to confront her own complicity in her daughter's abuse. The night before the trial was set to begin, Aaliyah sat with Jessica on the porch swing, looking up at the stars. "I'm scared," Aaliyah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jessica squeezed her hand gently. "It's okay to be scared," she said, "but remember, you're not alone. We're all here for you, and what you're doing is incredibly brave." Aaliyah nodded, drawing strength from Jessica's words and the support of her growing network of allies. As they sat there in the quiet night, Aaliyah realized that regardless of the trial's outcome, she had already won a significant victory. She had found her voice, and in doing so had given voice to countless others. The road ahead would be challenging, but Aaliyah was ready to face it, one step at a time. The morning of the trial arrived with a tense atmosphere hanging over the town. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, protesters, and curious onlookers. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as people filed in and took their seats. Aaliyah sat with her mother and Jessica, her small frame almost disappearing between them. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, widening as Walter was led in by court officers. It was the first time she had seen her father since the wedding, and the sight of him made her shrink back in her seat. As the trial began, the prosecution presented their case. They called witnesses who testified to Walter's volatile temper and controlling behavior. Teachers spoke of Aaliyah's withdrawn demeanor and unexplained absences. But the most damning testimony came from Sarah, Aaliyah's mother. Sarah took the stand, her hands shaking as she was sworn in. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "I knew something was wrong," she admitted. "I saw the bruises, the fear in Aaliyah's eyes, but I was too scared to do anything. I convinced myself it wasn't as bad as it seemed. I was wrong, and my daughter suffered because of my silence." Her testimony sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Walter's face darkened with anger, while his lawyer scrambled to damage control. But Sarah wasn't finished. In a move that surprised everyone, including her own lawyer, she revealed more. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I've never told anyone." She paused, gathering her courage. "Walter, he didn't just abuse Aaliyah. He abused me too, for years. I was too ashamed to admit it, too afraid to leave. But I can't stay silent anymore. Not when my daughter had the courage to speak up." The courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge called for order as Walter's lawyer demanded a recess. Aaliyah stared at her mother in shock, a mix of emotions playing across her face. As the trial recessed, news of Sarah's revelation spread quickly. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements while protesters renewed their calls for justice. The community, already divided, found itself grappling with this new information. Back inside, the prosecution team huddled with Sarah and Aaliyah. "Your mother's testimony could be a game changer," the lead prosecutor explained to Aaliyah. "But it also means the defense will fight even harder. Are you still prepared to testify?" Aaliyah nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I have to," she said. "For me, for Mom, and for anyone else who's been hurt like we have." When the trial resumed, Walter's defense team went on the offensive. They questioned Sarah's credibility, suggesting she was making up allegations to cover for her own neglect. They painted Aaliyah as a troubled child seeking attention, twisting her words and actions to fit their narrative. Finally, it was Aaliyah's turn to testify. As she took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She looked small and vulnerable, but her voice was steady as she began to speak. Aaliyah recounted years of abuse, describing in heart-wrenching detail the fear and pain she had endured. She spoke of being locked in the basement, of harsh punishments for minor infractions, of the constant terror that permeated her home life. Walter's lawyer cross-examined her aggressively, trying to trip her up or catch her in a lie. But Aaliyah stood firm, her responses clear and consistent. When asked why she hadn't spoken up sooner, her answer silenced the courtroom. "I was scared," she said simply. "Scared of what would happen if I told. Scared that no one would believe me. But I'm not scared anymore. I know the truth and I won't be silent about it any longer." As Aaliyah stepped down from the stand, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even some of Walter's staunchest supporters looked shaken by her testimony. The trial continued for several more days, with expert witnesses, character testimonies, and closing arguments. Finally, the case was turned over to the jury for deliberation. As they waited for the verdict, Aaliyah, Sarah, and their supporters gathered at Jessica's house. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Whatever the outcome, they knew that their fight had already made a difference. They had broken the silence surrounding abuse and given courage to others to speak out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. As they prepared to return to the courthouse, Aaliyah took a deep breath. The moment of truth had arrived, and she was ready to face it head-on. The courthouse was packed as everyone awaited the jury's verdict. Aaliyah sat between her mother and Jessica, her small hands clasped tightly in theirs. The air was thick with tension as the judge called the court to order. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The jury foreman stood, a piece of paper clutched in his hand. "We have, Your Honor." As the foreman read out the verdict, a collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Walter was found guilty on all counts. The judge's gavel came down confirming the verdict, and Walter was immediately taken into custody to await sentencing. The courtroom erupted into a mixture of cheers and shocked murmurs. Aaliyah burst into tears, a complex mix of relief, vindication, and residual fear washing over her. Sarah hugged her daughter tightly, her own tears flowing freely. Outside the courthouse, the news spread rapidly. Local media outlets rushed to report on the verdict, and social media exploded with reactions. Justice for Aaliyah began trending, with messages of support pouring in from around the country. As Aaliyah and her supporters left the courthouse, they were met by a crowd of well-wishers and reporters. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust forward as everyone clamored for a statement. Jessica stepped forward, shielding Aaliyah from the press. "We're grateful for the verdict," she said, her voice steady. "Aaliyah's bravery has not only brought her justice, but has also given hope to countless other victims. We ask for privacy as we begin the healing process." In the days that followed, Aaliyah found herself thrust into the spotlight. News outlets hailed her as a young hero, and invitations for interviews poured in. While part of her was overwhelmed by the attention, another part recognized the opportunity to make a difference. With guidance from Jessica and Mrs. Thompson, Aaliyah agreed to a few select interviews. She spoke eloquently about her experiences and the importance of speaking out against abuse. Her words resonated with many, inspiring other victims to come forward and communities to take a harder stance against child abuse. However, the increased visibility also brought new challenges. Walter, awaiting sentencing, made one last desperate attempt to discredit Aaliyah. Through his lawyer, he released a statement exposing sensitive information about other community members, claiming they were complicit in covering up various misdeeds. The statement caused an uproar in the community. Long-held secrets were suddenly thrust into the open, causing rifts between neighbors and friends. Some blamed Aliyah for starting the chain of events that led to this exposure. Aliyah was devastated by the backlash. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," she confided in Jessica one evening, her voice trembling. "I just wanted the truth to come out about what happened to me." Jessica hugged her tightly. "You did the right thing, Aliyah. Walter is trying to deflect blame and cause chaos. But remember, his actions are not your responsibility." Despite Jessica's reassurances, the situation took its toll on Aliyah. She began receiving anonymous threats online and in the mail. Cruel comments appeared on articles about her story, and some of her classmates started avoiding her at school. Concerned for Aliyah's safety, Sarah and Jessica decided to temporarily move her to a different school district. It was a difficult decision, but they felt it was necessary to give Aliyah some respite from the constant scrutiny and potential danger. The night before they were set to leave, Aliyah stood in her room, packing her belongings. She paused, holding a framed photo of herself with her parents, taken years ago when things seemed happier. A mix of emotions washed over her: sadness for the family she had lost, anger at the injustice she had suffered, but also hope for the future she was fighting to build. As she placed the photo in her bag, Aliyah made a silent promise to herself. She would not let the threats and negativity silence her. She would continue to speak out, to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for all victims of abuse. Outside, Sarah and Jessica were making final preparations for their departure. They knew the road ahead would be challenging, but they were committed to supporting Aliyah every step of the way. As the sun set on their last evening in the town that had been both a source of pain and strength, they looked towards the future with cautious optimism, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Aliyah, Sarah, and Jessica settled into their temporary home in a neighboring town. It was a small, rented house, but it offered them the sanctuary they desperately needed. Aliyah enrolled in her new school under a different last name, hoping to maintain some anonymity. Despite the change of scenery, the aftermath of the trial continued to ripple through their lives. Sarah spent hours on the phone with their lawyer, discussing the upcoming sentencing hearing and the potential for a civil suit against Walter. Jessica worked remotely, dividing her time between her job and helping Aliyah adjust to their new situation. One afternoon, as Aliyah was doing homework at the kitchen table, a breaking news alert flashed across Jessica's laptop screen. She clicked on it, her eyes widening as she read the headline. "Aliyah," Jessica called, her voice tense. "You need to see this." Aliyah came over, peering at the screen. The headline read, "Child abuse case uncovers deeper conspiracy. School officials accused of cover-up." The article detailed how Mrs. Thompson, following a hunch, had begun digging into Walter's past. Her investigation had uncovered a disturbing pattern of complaints against Walter that had been systematically buried by school administrators over the years. "I can't believe it," Aliyah whispered, her face pale. "All this time people knew." Jessica pulled Aliyah into a hug. "This isn't your fault," she said firmly. "You've exposed something much bigger than we realized." As they read through the article, more details emerged. Walter had been transferred between schools multiple times, each move coinciding with hushed-up complaints from students. The school board had repeatedly chosen to protect their reputation over the safety of their students. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Protests erupted outside the school district offices, with parents demanding answers and resignations. The state's Department of Education announced a full investigation into the matter. For Aliyah, the news brought a mix of vindication and renewed trauma. "Why didn't anyone help us sooner?" she asked, her voice breaking. Sarah, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "I don't know, sweetheart, but what matters is that you were brave enough to speak up when no one else would. You've saved other children from going through what you did." As the days passed, more victims came forward, emboldened by Aliyah's story and the ongoing investigation. The case was no longer just about Aliyah and Walter. It had become a catalyst for exposing a systemic failure to protect children. In the midst of this turmoil, Aaliyah received an unexpected call from Mrs. Thompson. "Aaliyah," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice filled with emotion. "I owe you an apology. I suspected something was wrong for a long time, but I didn't push hard enough. I'm so sorry I failed you." Aaliyah was quiet for a moment, processing Mrs. Thompson's words. "You didn't fail me," she finally said. "You believed me when I spoke up, and now you're helping make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." The conversation with Mrs. Thompson seemed to ignite something in Aaliyah. She began to see her experience not just as a personal tragedy, but as an opportunity to create real change. With Jessica's help, Aaliyah started a blog, sharing her story and providing resources for other abuse survivors. She was careful to protect her privacy, but her words reached far beyond their small community, touching lives across the country. As Walter's sentencing date approached, Aaliyah made a decision. She wanted to return to their hometown to deliver a victim impact statement in person. Sarah and Jessica were hesitant, concerned about her safety and emotional well-being. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, worry etched on her face. Aaliyah nodded, her expression resolute. "I need to do this," she said, "not just for me, but for every kid who's ever been afraid to speak up." As they prepared for the journey back, Aaliyah felt a mix of fear and determination. She knew facing Walter again would be difficult, but she also knew it was necessary. This time, she would look him in the eye not as a victim, but as a survivor who had found her voice and was using it to create change. The night before they were set to leave, Aaliyah stood by the window, looking out at the unfamiliar street. She thought about everything that had happened, everything that was still to come. It was a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it.